In a world that feels increasingly synthetic, we are searching for the metallic soul that still burns with genuine passion. Explore the fusion of technology and humanity in our latest series. Click subscribe now and join the conversation about what truly makes us human today.
The morning my brother filed the lawsuit, I was in a conference room 40 floors above Washington, D.C., signing paperwork that would never appear in any public record. My phone buzzed on the table. I silenced it without looking down. Whatever it was could wait. It always could. I didn't know then that it was a summons. That my brother, my own blood, had walked into a county courthouse back home in Millhaven, Ohio, and told the clerk that I had stolen from our dead father's estate. That he had stood there, in his barn jacket and work boots, and signed his name to a document accusing me of fraud. I found out 3 hours later, sitting in my car in a parking garage, reading the email from a lawyer I'd never heard of. I sat with it for a long time. Then I drove home, made myself a cup of tea, and went to bed. Some things you can't react to right away, not because you don't feel them, but because the feeling is so big, so old, so layered underneath years of other feelings, that if you let it out all at once, you might not be able to stop. Let me tell you about my brother first. His name is Owen. He's 6 years older than me, which means he was already in high school when I was still losing baby teeth. Already driving when I was riding my bike to the library on Saturday mornings. We were never close. Not because we fought, we didn't, not really, but because he was always my father's son in a way I never was my father's daughter. My father built things, fences, barns, a small equipment repair business that kept our family fed through my entire childhood. He respected work you could see, work that left calluses, work that at the end of the day you could point to and say, I made that. I was not that kind of person. I was the one who read through dinner, who asked questions at school that teachers didn't always know how to answer, who left Millhaven at 18 on a partial scholarship and never really came back except for holidays and funerals. To my father, I was a mystery he'd stopped trying to solve. To my brother, I was a ghost. When I got my first real job in D.C., entry level, nothing impressive on paper, working for an office whose full name I was not allowed to say out loud, I called home to tell them. My father asked if it paid well. I said it paid fine. He asked if I liked it. I said yes. He said okay and handed the phone to my mother, and that was the end of that conversation. I sent money home every few months, not a lot at first, enough to help when the water heater broke, enough to cover my father's hospital copay when his back went out in 2019. Enough that my mother once called me and cried a little and said she didn't know how she would have managed without me, and I told her not to worry about it, and she said she was glad I was doing so well in my government job, and I said yes, something like that. I never explained what I actually did. The work I did required that I not explain it, and honestly, even if it hadn't, I'm not sure it would have changed anything. In Millhaven, the thing that made you real was what you built with your hands. A title on a badge nobody was allowed to see didn't count. My father died 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. I drove home in February and sat by his hospital bed for 4 days, and on the 3rd day he looked at me and said, I never understood you, Callie. I took his hand and said, I know, Dad. He said, I hope that was okay. I told him it was. It wasn't, not entirely. But he was dying, and some truths you hold on to until the person who needs to hear them is gone. His will was a simple document. The house, the equipment business, and whatever remained in his accounts would be split, 60% to Owen, who had stayed and worked the land, and 40% to me. My father had added a note in the margin, handwritten, that said he hoped I wouldn't be upset about the difference. He'd always assumed I was doing fine on my own. I was. The problem was the savings account. My father had opened it when I was in college. It was in both our names, his and mine. He'd set it up that way because my mother suggested it, back when she was worried I wouldn't have a safety net so far from home. Over the years, he'd put money in occasionally. Birthday gifts, a few hundred here and there. What he hadn't known, what my brother didn't know, was that I had also been putting money into that account. Regularly. For 12 years. Not small amounts, the account had grown over time to just under $240,000. When my father died and the estate went into probate, Owen found the account, and when he saw the balance and saw both names on it, he made a decision about what kind of story he was going to tell. He decided it was his. His lawyer sent me a letter, claiming I had exploited a position of access to move family funds into a jointly held account, effectively stealing from the estate. The letter used phrases like pattern of financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary trust. It asked me to return the funds within 30 days or face civil litigation. I read the letter twice. I noted the lawyer's name. Then I called a woman I know in Maryland who does estate litigation and asked her if she had any availability. Her name is Harriet. She's been practicing for 22 years and she has a voice that sounds like she's perpetually unimpressed by everyone in the room. I love her. She told me not to worry. I said I wasn't worried. She laughed like she didn't quite believe me. She was right not to. I wasn't worried the way someone is worried when they think they might lose. I was worried the way you are when something is going to happen that you can't fully control and you don't know yet how much of yourself is going to be exposed before it's over. Owen's lawyer was a man named Patrick Sutton. I knew this because his name appeared on every piece of documentation that arrived at Harriet's office over the following 3 months. He had a website that described him as a tenacious advocate for family justice. He wore a tie in every photo. He was the kind of lawyer who was very good at making quiet people look guilty. I had been quiet for a long time. The hearing was set for a Thursday in April. A civil bench trial, no jury, just a judge. The courthouse in Millhaven was small, the kind of building that still had wooden pews in the gallery and a clock on the wall that ran 7 minutes fast. I had been inside it exactly once, at 17, for a traffic violation. I flew in the night before. I stayed at a Holiday Inn off the highway rather than at my mother's house because I didn't trust myself to sit across from Owen at the breakfast table and keep my face where it needed to be. My mother called me at 8 o'clock that night and asked if I was going to be okay. I told her yes. She asked if I needed anything. I said, just be there tomorrow. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, Callie, I know your brother thinks, Mom, I said, gently, I'll see you tomorrow. The morning of the hearing, I wore a gray suit I bought in Georgetown, small silver earrings, low heels. Nothing that would read as aggressive. Nothing that would give anyone a reason to look at me and make up a story before I'd had a chance to speak. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30. Harriet was already there, a leather portfolio under one arm, a coffee in the other hand. She nodded at me when I came through the door. Ready? She said. Yes, I said. She looked at me for a half-second longer than necessary. Then she said, the envelope arrived this morning, directly to the clerk's office, as we arranged. I nodded. The judge is Honorable Patricia Okafor, she said. She's been on the bench here for 11 years. Before that, she was federal. Before that, Harriet paused. Well, you'll see. I said nothing. Owen was already seated at the plaintiff's table when we walked into the courtroom. He was wearing a suit that looked like he'd bought it for the occasion, dark blue, slightly too wide in the shoulders. Patrick Sutton sat next to him, papers arranged in a neat row, a yellow legal pad at his elbow. Owen looked up when I came in. He didn't smile, neither did I. I sat down, folded my hands on the table, and faced the front of the room. The bailiff called the session to order. Judge Okafor came in through the side door, a compact woman in her late 50s, natural hair cropped short, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She moved like someone who had no interest in being watched, but was entirely comfortable being obeyed. She settled into her chair, looked at both tables, and said, Good morning, let's begin. Patrick Sutton opened with a confident summary of the case. The estate account was in both names, yes, but the origin of the funds was the plaintiff's family, money earned through the family business, money saved over decades by a working man who never had the advantages of a Washington education or a government paycheck. His client had managed that business. His client had stayed. His client had sacrificed. He used the word sacrifice 4 times in his opening statement. I counted. Then he looked at me, and his voice shifted into something that was designed to sound regretful, but wasn't. Miss Caldwell, he said, and I noticed he didn't say doctor, though Harriet had made sure that was on every filing. Can you tell this court what you do for a living? Harriet stood. Objection. Counsel is not yet in the examination phase. I'll allow it as context. Judge Okafor said evenly. You can answer, I said. I work in operations. Operations, Sutton repeated in a tone that made the words sound like a punchline. Could you be more specific? No, I said. I can't. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had practiced this exchange. You can't, he said. You work in operations in Washington, D.C., but you can't tell this court the name of your employer, the nature of your work, or provide a single pay stub, tax document under your current title or professional reference. Is that correct? That's partially correct, I said. Which part is incorrect? I can provide documentation, I said. I've arranged for it to be submitted directly to the court. Sutton paused. Just a fraction of a second, but I caught it. Submitted directly to the court, he said slowly. Not to the record. Not disclosed to the plaintiff. Correct, I said. And why is that? Because its contents are classified, I said. And I was advised by legal counsel that submitting it through standard channels would create a security concern. There was a murmur in the gallery. My mother was there in the second row. I didn't look at her. Sutton recovered quickly. He moved on. He spent the next 40 minutes building a picture of me as someone who had appeared out of nowhere, refused to account for her time, and managed to accumulate $250,000 in an account tied to a family she barely visited. He was good, I'll give him that. He called Owen to the stand. Owen testified that he had managed the family business for 15 years, that he had watched our father grow old doing physical labor while I was off in Washington doing God knows what. That when our father was sick, he, Owen, had been the one making the phone calls, managing the care, driving to appointments. That I had come for 4 days and then left. He wasn't wrong about most of it. He was just telling a story with the wrong ending. Sutton asked him about the account. Owen said he'd found it during probate review and that the balance had shocked him. He'd assumed, based on what he knew of my life, that I had very little saved. He couldn't imagine where I'd gotten that kind of money, unless... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. When it was Harriet's turn, she stood, smoothed her jacket, and said, Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to submit a sealed document into evidence. It was delivered to the clerk's office this morning from a federal agency under Title 50 of the United States Code. I would ask that you review it before we continue. Judge Okafor looked at Harriet, then at me. Then she said to the bailiff, Bring it. The bailiff retrieved a flat envelope from the clerk's desk. It was sealed with a red stripe and a wax emboss I recognized. The judge took it, turned it over once, and looked at the embossed seal. Something shifted in her face. She set the envelope flat on her desk. She put her reading glasses on. She broke the seal. The courtroom was completely silent. She read for 3 minutes. I know because there was a clock above the door, and I watched it the whole time. The bailiff stood still. Patrick Sutton had his pen in his hand and had not moved it. Owen was watching the judge with a look I recognized from childhood, the look he got when something wasn't going the way he expected. Judge Okafor finished reading. She set the document down. She took her glasses off. She said quietly, We'll take a 15-minute recess. When we came back, the air in the room had changed. Judge Okafor was already seated. She looked at Patrick Sutton and said, Counselor, I want to be clear about what has been submitted to this court. I am not at liberty to enter this document into the public record. However, I can confirm that I have reviewed documentation from a federal agency that establishes the defendant's employment history, income history, and the lawful origin of all funds in the account in question, in full. Sutton stood. Your Honor, with respect, if that documentation cannot be entered into the record, it establishes, the judge said, in a tone that closed the sentence for him, that every dollar in that account was deposited by the defendant. Not 1 cent came from the decedent's estate. Silence. Furthermore, she said, I am going to ask that plaintiff's counsel review the financial documentation the defendant has submitted separately through Harriet Bloom's office, the tax and employment records filed under a redacted identification number, and that you consider, before we go any further, whether you would like to amend or withdraw this complaint. Sutton sat down slowly. He leaned toward Owen. I saw him whisper something. Owen's face had gone very still. Judge Okafor looked at me. I have been looked at by many people in many rooms over many years. I have learned to keep my face neutral, but there was something in her expression that I hadn't expected. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition, like she had seen this room before from a different angle. She said, Miss Caldwell, you've been very patient. I said, Thank you, Your Honor. She turned back to the room. Mr. Sutton, you have 24 hours to submit an amended filing or a motion to dismiss. I strongly suggest you use them. Outside, the spring air was cold and thin. The parking lot behind the courthouse had 2 cars in it and a crow sitting on a concrete barrier. My mother came out behind me. She didn't say anything for a moment. We stood there looking at the crow. Then she said, "How long?" I said. 16 years. The job. Yes. She was quiet. Then she said, "Your father would not have understood it." "No," I said. "He wouldn't have." "But he would have been proud," she said. "He was proud of you. He just didn't know how to say it without understanding it first." I looked at the crow. It ruffled its feathers and looked back at me. I said, "I know." I wasn't sure I believed it, but I was 41 years old and my father was gone, and some things you choose to believe because the alternative is carrying something too heavy for the rest of your life. Harriet came out a few minutes later. She stood beside me and said, "Sutton called me while we were still in the building. He's withdrawing." I nodded. He also said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he feels he was given incomplete information by his client. I almost laughed. That's one way to put it. Harriet looked at me sideways. "You knew, didn't you, that she'd been on the federal bench?" "I hoped," I said. I looked up her record when Harriet told me the assignment. There was a window where she held a clearance. I thought she might know how to handle the document without it becoming a spectacle. Harriet shook her head slowly. "You're a very unusual client." "I've been told," I said. "Owen called me that evening. I almost didn't pick up. Then I thought about my father saying I never understood you and the way his hand had felt in mine at the end, and I answered. He said, 'The lawyer told me I had no case.' I said, 'You didn't.' Silence. He said, 'I didn't think you had that kind of money.' I know," I said. "What do you actually do, Callie?" I looked down my window at the highway, the neon signs, the ordinary American dark. I thought about all the things I'd done in 16 years that I would never tell him. The places I'd been. The decisions I'd been part of that had changed things in ways he would never read about in any newspaper. "I work in operations," I said. "That's still all I can tell you." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I think I—" He stopped. Started again. I think I told myself a story that was easier than not knowing. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in 20 years. I said, "I know how that goes. We didn't fix anything that night. You don't fix 20 years in one phone call." But when I hung up, I felt something loosen in my chest, not forgiveness. Exactly, not yet, but the first small loosening of something that had been knotted for a long time. I drove back to Washington the next morning. The highway was empty at that hour, just trucks in long, pale light coming up over the fields. Somewhere outside Columbus, I stopped for coffee at a gas station, the kind of place that's been there since before the interstate, with a handwritten sign in the window and a cat sleeping on the counter. The woman at the register handed me my change and looked at the lapel pin on my jacket, a small silver thing stylized that I'd worn so long I'd stopped noticing it. "Pretty pin," she said. "What's it mean?" I looked down at it. A habit I'd carried for 16 years, through offices and airports and rooms where the stakes had been as high as stakes could go. A small piece of metal that meant I was here. I did this. No one will ever know. "It's a department thing," I said. She nodded, like that made perfect sense. "Have a safe drive, hon." I got back in the car. I pulled out of the parking lot onto the empty highway, and the sun came up ahead of me, and I drove toward it. Some things you do because you were asked to. Some things you do because you're good at them. And some things you do because the world is complicated and someone has to know where all the weight is, and you've decided, a long time ago, that you can carry yours quietly. I was just keeping the books, I thought. The highway stretched out ahead of me, long and straight and lit up gold in the early morning. I kept driving. I thought a lot about what Owen said on the phone that night, that he told himself a story that was easier than not knowing. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. I'd told myself a few of those stories too, that it didn't matter whether my father understood me, that I didn't need Owen's respect, that being invisible was just the cost of the work I'd chosen. Some of those stories were true. Some of them were just easier than sitting with how much it hurt to be a stranger in your own family. What I keep coming back to is this. Owen didn't sue me because he was a bad person. He sued me because he looked at my life and saw nothing he recognized, and instead of sitting with that uncertainty, he filled it in with something that made sense to him. People do that. We all do. We take the gaps in what we know, and we write in what fits the story we already believe. Owen believed I was the one who left, the one who didn't stay, the one who didn't sacrifice. So when he found that account, his mind went straight to the explanation that confirmed what he already thought. That's not malice. That's just what happens when you stop being curious about people and start being certain about them instead. I spent 16 years in work that required me to hold enormous uncertainty without letting it collapse into false certainty, to say, I don't know yet, and keep going anyway, to resist the pull of the easy answer when the real answer was still forming. It turns out that's not just a professional skill. It's the only way to actually see the people in front of you, to stay curious about them long enough to let them be more complicated than your first read. My father never managed it with me. I don't think he knew how. And I spent a long time being angry about that and then a longer time pretending I wasn't. What the courtroom that Thursday morning gave me, unexpectedly, in a way I hadn't prepared for, was a kind of finality. Not justice exactly. Just the closing of a door I'd been standing in front of for 20 years. The record was set straight, not for anyone else. Just for me. Just so I could know that the truth existed somewhere, even if only a federal judge and a sealed file cabinet would ever hold it. There's something I want to say about the work it takes to build a life that nobody sees. Not the dramatic parts. Not the sealed envelopes or the clearance levels or the federal agencies. I mean the ordinary part. The part where you get up every day and do something hard and come home and don't talk about it. Where you send money home quietly and don't explain why. Where you show up at a hospital bed and hold a hand and say, I know, Dad, when what you mean is so much larger than those 3 words can carry. That kind of endurance doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, quietly, like interest in an account nobody thought to look at. Owen looked at my life and saw emptiness. What was actually there was just invisible to him. I don't think I'm unique in that. I think a lot of people are carrying more than anyone around them knows. Doing more, giving more, holding more, in silence, out of necessity or habit or love, or just because that's who they are. And sometimes the people closest to them look at that silence and mistake it for nothing. It isn't nothing. It never was. I drove home from Mill Haven with a pin on my lapel and a cup of gas station coffee in 16 years of work that will never appear in any newspaper. And I thought, that's enough. To have done it. To have been it. To know, even if only you know, that when the moment came, the truth could speak for itself. That's the only thing that has ever felt like enough to me.